Hi, my name is Aaron, this is my show Reeducation, and today we're going to talk a little bit about Rome, specifically about Roman military tactics. And we're going to talk about this for really no reason whatsoever. So with all of that being said, let's get into it. Rome is a really interesting place, and it goes back over 1,000 years. It actually first started in Italy, and eventually it was able to overtake basically the entire Mediterranean. They existed for, like I said, over 1,000 years, and throughout that 1,000 years, they actually did a lot of really interesting things. One of the most interesting things, and the thing that we're going to talk about today, is that they were sort of a warrior race. They settled and evolved in an extremely turbulent time where there were a lot of warlords, a lot of warriors, a lot of war in general going on. So there was a lot of strife and a lot of people had to fight to survive. So it turns out that because of this history, Rome has some of the most interesting and most in-depth information about military tactics and warfare basically on the face of the earth. Every modern military in some way bases a certain amount of their strategy on military strategy based on Rome, and that's really interesting because I think for us to fully get a good understanding of how tactics work, it's one of the things that we talk about a lot on this channel, we have to really understand Roman tactics. So with all of that being said, let's get into it. Okay, so first we're going to talk a little bit about the formations within a Roman legion. The very first thing that I want to talk about is something called a contubernium. It's actually the smallest number of people in something called a Roman legion, which is a giant mass of people organized very strategically so they can fight in large-scale wars. But the smallest grouping of that people back then was called a contubernium. And it's very similar, actually almost identical, to what we now refer to as a squad. A contubernium, or in modern terms we refer to it as a squad, is typically the smallest organization that a military unit has. It's often comprised of about 8 people, with one of them being the squad leader and the other 7 being regular officers. Typically you'll have one of those officers as a point person, and they basically function as the lead whenever they're doing some kind of charge. In Roman times, they had a special group of individuals called velites that would actually do skirmishes and throw spears at the very beginning, at the very head of a Roman legion. They would basically work to break up any kind of phalanx or line or whatever it was that was off in the distance. Though these troops were often organized into contuberniums as well, they were not often organized within the same contubernium as another group. Now, behind them, they usually had a line of hastati, principes, and triarii. Now, the hastati were basically the younger of the elite troops, the ones that were going to walk in with their shields and their spears and do most of the damage. And they were followed in age by the hastati, who were a little bit older, and the triarii, who were the veteran elite soldiers who, if at the last minute had to be called in to save the day, they could be. And a lot of people in ancient Rome called that falling back on the triarii. It became kind of like a meme of the day. That's what they would say. If you were in an incredibly difficult situation and you had to ask for help, it was basically called falling back on the triarii. Now, getting back to that contubernium, that group of 8 people that I was talking about a moment ago, the squad, were some of those people velites? Were some of them triarii? Were some of them hastati? Well, no, not typically. Usually they were just a group of 8 people that were triarii, a group of 8 people that were hastati, a group of 8 people that were whatever, velites, whatever, and they would all work together, usually as a unit. They would sleep in the same tent, they would all work together, blah, 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 blah. But the interesting thing about the contubernium, about that squad, is that we can take that and bring it into modern day and morph it and change it to whatever we really wanted to use it for. So, if we wanted to have, say, some of those velites in that squad, we could do so. And getting back to that original formation, if you have a group of 8 people within a squad, one of those people is going to be the point person, one of those people is going to be the squad leader, and at the very end of that line, you can often have a grenader, or somebody that uses projectile weaponry. Something very similar to those velites that I was talking about at the beginning that throw the spears or throw the projectile weapons. Basically, it's the same sort of thing. So in a modern day squad, or in a modern day contubernium, which is basically what it is, you will have typically the squad leader, the point person, all of the other officers, followed by a grenadier or grenadier at the very end of that line. Some of the most important things that we have to talk about when we're talking about Roman soldiers is they use a lot of mental warfare on their opponents before they even engage in the physical battle. And a lot of that has to do with making the opponent think that they are so much larger, so much stronger, and so much more fierce than they actually are. And this goes all the way back to ancient Greece and every other civilization that has ever existed. The idea is to demoralize and demotivate the enemy before you even get onto the battlefield. And this is done in many different ways. But some of the most important ways that they usually do this is by stomping their feet in a rhythmic pattern, marching in unison, usually in large blocks or large groups of people, possibly in large line formations. And while they do this, they'll beat their shields rhythmically and chant or yell battle cries or whatever it is. This is mental warfare to scare the enemy into believing that the Romans were just the most powerful group and that nobody should even think of opposing them. Roman soldiers were extremely methodical and organized, and you'll notice that all of their military units break down into smaller forms that are functionally able to perform similar or identical tasks as their larger formations. They were able to do this through intense discipline, a lot of training, and usually they could organize on the fly using things like verbal commands and hand signals. Now, obviously, if the group was extremely large, they would use other instruments like horns and that sort of thing so they could get control over the entire group. But in smaller groups, they would typically be able to do everything with hand signals and verbal commands. And we actually see the exact same thing in modern times when we're talking about modern militaries or police forces, SWAT teams, that sort of thing. They all tend to use loud verbal commands and arm signals. For example, in that contubernium, in that line formation I was talking about a moment ago, in modern days, that specific line is referred to as dress and cover, and has a very specific set of hand signals and verbal commands to go along with it. Column formation typically uses the verbal command post, with one arm raised above the head like this, with the hand clenched into a fist, and that basically means to organize into a single line. If there are several different squads, say for example 4 squads that you wanted to organize into a platoon, then you could typically put up both arms with your fists clenched and say post, and that would signify to the group that you wanted a double column formation. Basically, the 4 squads divide into 2 groups and stand in 2 parallel lines beside each other. One of the interesting things about these squads or contubernium is that you can use them in several different ways, and typically in modern days we can use them in tight spacing or tactical spacing. Tight spacing basically means that everybody is going to be standing very close together, often overlapping one another, so they form a very strong, very tight line of people that seems like it's impenetrable. While conversely, tactical spacing can be used in areas where there aren't as many officers, or there are much larger streets, or there are much larger amounts of people. You spread out and you stand far enough away from your neighbor that you can actually span the entire length of, say, a highway or whatever exactly it is that they want to do the push through. So tight spacing is when everybody is really close together, often overlapped, so they have a very solid line of people. And tactical spacing is when they spread out more, allowing for more gaps and more spaces in between each person. One of the main reasons why modern day militaries or even police forces use tactical spacing, specifically in urban environments, say during a uprising or a protest, is to basically filter the crowd and grab hold of any individuals who they think could be rowdy or breaking the law. Basically, they work as a filter or a rake to go through the crowd and pull out individuals that they want to basically arrest. The next thing I want to talk about is something called a phalanx. A phalanx is a very, very old military formation that basically works as a group of people standing in a line or in a row. Typically, these people will have large shields that cover large portions of their bodies, and often in medieval history and going back to ancient Roman history and that sort of thing, you would typically have these people holding extremely long spears and pointing them out forwards so nobody is able to actually attack them head on. This strategy advanced all throughout the beginning stages of Roman history, and even before that, to not just include a group of people that were one line, but several groups of people behind each other, all with these long pole arms working in succession to drop them down as the people in the front either fell back or were murdered. This is one of the oldest military formations in history, and it's one of the most successful. But even though it was used extensively by the early Romans, the Romans also found an incredibly smart way to defeat the Phalanx. In fact, they came up with many. We're going to talk about a Phalanx or a skirmish line on its basic smallest level right now, because there's no real reason for us to talk about hundreds and hundreds of men forming a Phalanx so they can defeat a Roman legion. It's not really applicable to our situation at the moment. But we will look at a basic Phalanx or skirmish line, if you will, in regards to 4 squads or a whole platoon. Now, like I was explaining before, typically if you were to form a skirmish line or a phalanx, you'll have a group of individuals standing shoulder to shoulder to each other, holding large shields covering large size portions of their bodies, just like I had mentioned a moment ago. They form a line, and typically behind that line, that's where you're going to have all of your important people. That's where you're going to have your generals, or, well, basically your platoon leaders, your squad leaders, that sort of thing. Typically, the squad leaders will fall directly behind their squads, and behind them will be the platoon leaders. Now, in modern military formations, or even in police formations, say in China, often standing behind that skirmish line, you're going to have a group of other individuals, sometimes an arrest team, and often more of those grenaders, or people that throw projectile weapons, and they typically stand behind that line so they can have a certain amount of protection, so they can actually wind up and throw the thing that they want to throw, or launch the grenade that they want to launch, or in older military formations, throw their spear, shoot your arrow, fire your crossbow, shoot them with your cannon, whatever exactly it would be. In modern military, the preparatory command for that is line formation, and you'll typically hold your arms straight out like this, with your hands pointed straight out, and the command for execution of that is move. Next, we're going to talk about the cuneium formate, or the wedge formation if you don't speak ancient Roman. And basically, it's a very simple formation, and it's shaped like a triangle. The wedge formation is an extremely intelligent military tactical maneuver that allows for the ability to break any sort of phalanx or line. A wedge formation basically concentrates all of its energy at the tip, or the point person at the very start or at the very front of that wedge. It works to cut through military lines and opens up big gaps within that phalanx, allowing them to basically surround the enemy and take control of them. The person at the front and all of the subsequent people behind them would all be holding their shields in the direction that they were all running, and they would work to use those shields as blunt force weapons to basically push all of the other soldiers out of the way and open up that gap, while also using their gladius or spears to get rid of those individuals on either side. And in modern day militaries, if they want to do a wedge formation, they basically hold their arms up in a V shape with the arms extended like this, and hands and fingers open and pointed outwards. Again, the command of execution for that maneuver is move. Okay, so the next thing that we're going to talk about is something called an encirclement, which is a very old military maneuver where basically a group of individuals, say a platoon, go out into a crowd and they encircle somebody. Sometimes they want to attack them, sometimes they want to arrest them, sometimes they want to save them. It really depends on what the encirclement is for. There's a whole lot of reasons why they could do an encirclement, but basically the objective is to go out into the middle of a crowd and encircle a specific individual. Now, typically you'll have all 4 squads forming themselves into a circular formation, and every second person facing outwards, while every first person is facing inwards towards the circle. Outside of that circle, you'll have your platoon and squad leaders, and they will basically organize the circle or the encirclement to do whatever it is they want to do to the person that's in the middle of that circle. It basically works like a magic protectionary circle, and the verbal commands for that are encirclement, encirclement, and the hand signals for that are a circle shape above the head with your hands not quite touching. Typically, a Roman sentry is shaped like a square. There's about 100 people in there, thus the name sentry. And the sentry itself is made up of lines of contubernum, or those groups of 8 individuals forming that squad. A sentry forms a square-shaped formation, and that's basically to defend from all different angles. If anybody comes from the front, they can defend that. If they come from the rear, it only takes a quick maneuver, an about face, and they can face the other direction and basically attack that enemy. The same thing goes for the left, the same thing goes for the right. On every single side, they're basically protected. But when you get to a smaller group, when you're getting down to small-sized groups like, say, the platoon or the squad, where it's only a few dozen people, you have to still be able to find a way to protect yourself on all 4 sides, or at least on more than 2 sides. The reason being is that a skirmish line, or a phalanx, is extremely weak on either end and from behind. Like I said before, all of the most important people in a phalanx are standing behind the phalanx itself. That's where you have all of your generals, that's where you have all of your commanders, that's where you have, in modern terms, all of your arrest teams, and squad leaders, and platoon leaders, and all of the important people are all standing in behind that skirmish line. So obviously, they want to find a way to protect that skirmish line from either the sides or from the rear so no enemies are able to come up behind them and mess them up. So even though a platoon of people is only 4 squads of 8 individuals, they can still find a way to protect themselves on all sides without being attacked from either side or from the rear. Obviously, the formation that stops them from being able to be attacked on all sides, if they're in a group that small, is typically the encirclement formation, but with everybody facing outwards. In Roman times, this maneuver was called an orb, and it was to be only used in very last resorts, and if you have a small group of people and they're surrounded by a larger group of people, that would be the time to use the orb. Or if they wanted to use some sort of square formation so they could still hold that skirmish line, what they could use is something called a lateral support formation. Basically where 2 squads hold that skirmish line formation, like I was talking about a moment ago, and another 2 squads actually form a column or line on either side, so they're basically able to protect the corners of that skirmish line. That basically allows them to form either a right angle or a C-shaped formation, depending on what they need at the time. And the verbal commands for that are lateral support, left, or lateral support, right, or lateral support, left and right. Obviously corresponding with the hand signals of lateral support right, lateral support left, or lateral support left and right. And you usually do this while putting your hands and arms in towards your head in waving motion like this. Now, something that I haven't necessarily seen in Roman tactics, but I have seen in modern military and police tactics, is something known as a separation. It's kind of like the idea of parting the Red Sea, and we actually seen this play out in real time in Charlottesville, North Carolina, during the Unite the Right rally. Basically, a bunch of officers were able to come into the center of Emancipation Park and form a skirmish line. That skirmish line then broke into 2 skirmish lines, which worked to slowly move everyone out of the park by dividing themselves and moving outwards like this. The squads immediately at the very beginning of this move 5 paces at half step using the port arms push. Now, the port arms push is basically where they hold a rifle or a baton like this, underhand, overhand, and they push out from their chest to push somebody away. And half step is basically a military way of saying that they move slowly but steadily, 1 step at a time. They move their 1 foot forward 1 step, and they put their other foot next to that first foot in basically what looks like a short march. Now, another formation that, again, I haven't necessarily seen in ancient Roman times, though I'd be surprised if they didn't use it, is another formation called a crossbow. The way this formation works is very simple. You set up a basic skirmish line of 2 squads, and behind that skirmish line you have 2 columns comprised of the other 2 squads. When given the command, they work as basically the bolt of a crossbow launching themselves out through the front of that skirmish line, having some of the officers stand off to one side, allowing them to come through. And they basically shoot themselves out into the middle of the crowd, no more than 15 meters, where they can perform an encirclement technique or form another skirmish line. Interestingly, with this specific maneuver, you can tell what the officers are going to do depending on how loud they are before they go about doing their little crossbow activity. If they're going to do a protection encirclement or they're going to form another skirmish line, they're going to be very loud and announce abruptly that they're going to be launching themselves into the crowd. Whereas, if they do something known as an encirclement arrest, they will often do that very quietly and very sneakily so nobody knows that they're actually going to do it. If they want to form a skirmish line or maybe an encirclement to save somebody, they will often announce very loudly that they're going to come through the crowd. There will be a lot of grunting, a lot of loud noises, and they'll basically make as much of a commotion as possible to scare people away from being in that area and move them all back. Whereas, if they're doing something sneaky like an arrest, they don't want to scare the person that they're going out to arrest, so they do that as quietly as possible. Interestingly, if they get out there and the person that they're going to arrest runs away, they are authorized not to chase them down at all because they would be dividing themselves up and breaking that line, so they are required to immediately form back into a circle and find their way back behind the skirmish line. And obviously there are a lot of different verbal and arm signals to signify what they want to do within that crossbow, but typically the commands start off as crossbow, holding above your head, followed by a line formation with your hands extended like this, just like before, an encirclement with one hand grasping the wrist of the other, indicating an arrest, or an encirclement with one hand grasping the other as a fist like this to signify a rescue. And of course the command of execution for that is move. One more thing that I want to talk about just before I go is the reason why they often used cavalry in ancient Rome and other civilizations back in ancient history. And that was because horses are much taller and stronger than human beings. So if there is a large crowd of people and you send a bunch of horses in there, you'll be able to create a dominant effect where you are larger, you are stronger, and you are more maneuverable than all of the small individual humans down below. And they're easily able to be hit and beaten away with any weapons that the opposing force has. Now, I have so much more to talk about, but I have to end it here because this video is running so long. So thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed this content, hit that little like button, give us a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, hit the little bell button because they are not going to tell you when I release a video, and they're unsubscribing people every single day, so make sure that you're still subscribed. And thank you very much for watching. Have a nice day.